This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a mono-red burn commander deck with Imodane the Pyrohammer as the general. Imodane the Pyrohammer debuted in Wilds of Eldraine and is a 4/4 human knight for 2 and 2 red mana. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell we control that targets only a single creature deals damage to that creature, Imodane deals that much damage to each opponent. By casting burn spells directed at creatures, Imodane slings that much direct damage to each of our opponents. This personalized and global repercussion-like effect will end games very quickly in a dedicated burn build like this one. Our vision with Imodane as our general is quite clear. We will inundate the core of this build with single-target burn spells, some damage accelerators, some additional spell-slinging payoffs, and a few surprises that our opponents may not expect. With Imodane on our side of the battlefield, we will lop off chunks of our opponent's life totals with great ease on the path to imminent victory. Let's begin filling the core of this build with some single-target fixed damage burn spells. Flame Slash deals 4 damage to target creature. As an additional cost to cast Lightning Axe, we discard a card or pay 5 generic mana. Let's choose to discard a card here. Lightning Axe deals 5 damage to target creature. If it is our turn, then we may sacrifice a mountain rather than paying Mind Collapse's mana cost. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Note the very low mana values of these spells in comparison to the amount of direct damage they deal. For some burn spells whose amount of damage incrementally grows as the game unfolds, Seismic Strike and Spitting Earth deal damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains we control, which should be quite high in a mono-red build like this one. Spite of Mogis deals damage to target creature equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in our graveyard, and then we scry 1. Again, in a spell-slinging burn build like this one, that number should also be quite high, especially for the investment of just 1 red mana. As an additional cost to cast Harvest Pyre, we exile X cards from our graveyard. It deals X damage to target creature. Shivan Meteor is in a class all by itself. It deals 13 damage to target creature. We can either cast this spell for 3 and 2 red mana, or we can pay 1 and 2 red mana and suspend it with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of our upkeep, we remove a time counter from it, and when the last is removed, we cast it without paying its mana cost. If we suspend this card, then it provides the opportunity for our opponents to plan for its imminent casting. It serves us best to cast this spell for its 3 and 2 red mana cost, which is still a tremendous value considering we deal 13 damage to target creature for the investment of just 5 mana. Fixed damage and incremental damage are nice options, but spells with X in their mana costs allow us to adjust or inflate the amount of direct damage we want to deal. Comet Storm has multi-kicker 1, which means that we may pay an additional 1 generic mana any number of times as we cast the spell. We choose any target, and then choose another target for each time Comet Storm was kicked. It deals X damage to each of those targets. Note that Imodane's ability only triggers when an instant or sorcery spell we control targets a single creature. Multi-kicking Comet Storm to deal X damage to multiple targets will not trigger our general's direct damage ability. The same can be said for Fireball. It costs 1 more to cast for each target beyond the first. Fireball deals X damage divided evenly and rounded down among any number of targets. However, Imodane wants us to simply deal X damage to target creature so she can sling that same amount of direct damage to our opponents. Unless needed, let's target a single creature with these 2 spells. Crackle with Power follows suit. It deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. Note that we must pay the same amount of mana for each instance of X in this spell's mana cost. Also note that the up to clause allows us to direct all of the damage to just one target creature. If X equals 3 here, then we can deal 15 damage to one target creature, and then Imodane would deal 15 damage to each opponent. Another powerful up-to spell is Shatterskull Smashing. It deals X damage divided as we choose among up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. If X is 6 or more, then Shatterskull Smashing deals twice X damage divided as we choose among those targets instead. Similar to Crackle with Power, we can deal all of the damage to just one target creature. If needed, then we could opt to play the backside of this card instead of casting the front side by putting Shatterskull the Hammer Pass into play. As this land enters the battlefield, we must pay 3 life. If we don't, then it comes into play tapped. We can tap it to add 1 red mana to our mana pool. We also have some cards that deal X damage in addition to providing some additional peripheral benefits. Red Sun Zenith deals X damage to any target. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, we exile it instead. We then shuffle Red Sun Zenith into our library. Banefire deals X damage to any target, and if X is 5 or more, Banefire cannot be countered and the damage cannot be prevented. Crater's Claw deals X damage to any target, and through its ferocious mechanic, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, then it deals X plus 2 damage instead. Torch Breath cannot be countered, costs 2 generic mana less to cast if it targets a blue permanent, and deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. Electro Dominance deals X damage to any target, and we may cast a spell with mana value X or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. Note that if a spell with X in its mana cost is cast without paying its mana cost, then X is 0. So let's avoid casting any X spells from our hand through Electro Dominance's ability. Ravaging Blaze deals X damage to target creature, and through its spell mastery mechanic, if we have at least 2 instant and or sorcery cards in our graveyard, then Ravaging Blaze also deals X damage to that creature's controller. Note that the creature's controller is not being targeted with this direct damage, so Imodane would trigger. This means that one opponent is going to get dealt X damage twice, once from Ravaging Blaze, and another from Imodane. Dealing direct damage is great. Dealing double direct damage is even better. Stone Splitter Bolt deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. However, if we bargain this spell by sacrificing an artifact, enchantment, or token as we cast it, then it deals twice X damage to that permanent instead. Purphoros' Intervention provides 2 options from which to choose. We either create an X1 red elemental creature token with haste and trample that is exiled at the beginning of the next end step, or we have Purphoros' Intervention deal twice X damage to target creature or planeswalker. Since our build is focused on dealing direct damage, let's include some cards that reward us for doing so. Chandra's Incinerator costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to our opponents this turn. And whenever a source we control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. Note that the Incinerator's second ability will not trigger Imodane, since its damage is being dealt as a triggered ability and not through an instant or sorcery spell. If a source we control deals non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, then Sulfim Mayhem Dominus has it deal double that damage to that player or permanent instead. We also can put an indestructible counter on Sulfim by paying 1 generic mana and 2 red Phyrexian mana and discarding 2 cards. Red Phyrexian mana is paid by either 1 red mana or 2 life. Whenever a creature or a planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, which we should be doing quite often in this build, then Toralf, God of Fury, deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. As mentioned with Chandra's Incinerator, note that Toralf's direct damage does not trigger Imodane. It is a triggered ability and not an instant or sorcery spell. We also have the option of casting this card as Toralf's Hammer instead. This legendary equipment gives equipped creature pay 1 and 1 red mana, tap an unattached Toralf's Hammer to deal 3 damage to any target, and we return Toralf's Hammer to its owner's hand. The equip cost is 1 and 1 red mana, and as long as the equipped creature is legendary, it also gets +3/+0. The hammer provides an outlet to deal direct damage, but Toralf gives us the bigger bang for our mana investing bucks. Whenever a creature an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Fall of Kyr-Andros has us amass Orcs X, where X is that excess damage. To amass Orcs X, we put X +1/+1 counters on an army we control. It's also an Orc. If we don't control an army, then we create a 0/0 black Orc army creature token first. As we deal overly lethal quantities of direct damage to our opponent's creatures, we reward ourselves for doing so by creating a beat-down Orc army. As another bonus, we can pay 7 and 1 red mana to have Fall of Kyr-Andros deal 7 damage to target creature. The return on this mana investment is in line with many of our aforementioned X burn spells, and as a bonus, this ability is repeatable throughout the game, making this innocuous enchantment one of the most powerful cards in the core of this build. Now let's make our opponents feel even more burned by accelerating the damage that we deal to them. If a red source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, then Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, has it deal that much damage +2 instead. If a red instant or sorcery spell we control would deal damage, and we have a lot of them here, then Fire Servant has it deal double that damage instead. If a source we control would deal damage to a permanent or a player, Aimgrass Marauders has it deal double that damage to that permanent or player instead. Gratuitous Violence is similar. If a creature we control would deal damage to a permanent or a player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. Note that the creature does not have to deal combat damage for Gratuitous Violence to trigger. Imodane's direct damage ability also triggers it. If a source we control deals damage to a permanent or a player, then Fiery Emancipation and City on Fire deal triple that damage instead. Note that City on Fire has Convoke, which means that our creatures can help us cast it. Each creature we tap while casting City on Fire pays for 1 generic mana or 1 mana of that creature's color. If one of these enchantments is paired alongside Imodane on our side of the battlefield, then any of the aforementioned direct damage spells would deal triple its damage to target creature, and then Imodane would deal triple that damage to each opponent, which should be more than enough damage to win the game. With so many spells to sling in this burn build, let's include some peripheral benefits for doing so. Kessig Flamebreather and Firebrand Archer deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cast a non-creature spell, while Erebor, Flamesmith, and Electrostatic Field deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell. We can tap Unruly Catapult and Thermal Alchemist to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we can untap them. Gutter Snipe and Fiery Inscription deal 2 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell. Note that when Fiery Inscription enters the battlefield, the ring tempts us. As the ring tempts us, we get an emblem named the Ring if we don't already have one. Then, our emblem gains the next ability, and we choose a creature we control to become or remain our ring bearer. Note that this build does not have any other ring synergies outside of Fiery Inscription. For resource development, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Stormkiln Artist creates a treasure token, for which we can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, Young Pyromancer creates a 1/1 red elemental creature token. Remember, Imodane's ability triggers whenever a single creature is targeted, and that single creature can reside on our side of the battlefield. Speaking of creatures on our side of the battlefield, if our opponents decide not to put creatures into play for the purposes of nixing Imodane's ability, then we are prepared to target our own creatures over and over and over and over again. How? Well, creatures with Indestructible cannot be destroyed by lethal damage. In this scenario, we can target a creature we control with Indestructible for the purposes of triggering Imodane, and that creature survives to be targeted again and again. Our opponents may not survive. The aforementioned Solphim Mayhem Dominus fits this description after we place an indestructible counter onto it, of course. Other indestructible creature options include Darksteel Mirror and Amaranthan Wall, for whom we could pay 2 generic mana and make indestructible until end of turn. Although it enters the battlefield as an indestructible artifact, we can pay 3 generic mana to have Darksteel Brute become a 2/2 artifact creature until end of turn. As long as Manor Gargoyle has Defender, it also has Indestructible. We can pay 1 generic mana and have Mana Gargoyle lose Defender and gain Flying, which also means that it loses Indestructible. Let's keep it indestructible and let Imodane deal the damage to our opponents. Darksteel Juggernaut's power and toughness are each equal to the number of artifacts we control, and it must attack each turn if able. Darksteel Juggernaut counts itself as an artifact, so minimally we have a 1/1 creature that cannot be destroyed. As an additional cost to cast Spark Hunter Masticore, we must discard a card. Spark Hunter Masticore has protection from Planeswalkers, and we can pay 1 generic mana to have it deal 1 damage to target Planeswalker. We can also pay 3 generic mana to give it indestructible until end of turn. We also have Creepy Doll, Stuffy Doll, and Brash Taunter. Whenever Creepy Doll deals combat damage to a creature, we flip a coin. If we win the flip, then we destroy that creature. When Stuffy Doll enters the battlefield, we choose a player. Whenever Stuffy Doll is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to the chosen player. Brash Taunter follows suit, except it deals its damage to target opponent instead. Stuffy Doll and Brash Taunter also have self-damaging activated abilities. Stuffy Doll taps to deal 1 damage to itself, while we can pay 2 and 1 red mana and tap Brash Taunter to fight another target creature. When creatures fight, each creature deals damage equal to its power to the other. Most likely, both creatures would survive a fight being picked by Brash Taunter. However, the direct damage dealt to target opponent as a result gives us the upper hand. The Dolls and Brash Taunter are not going to set the world on fire with their combat efficiency. However, when paired with Imodane and our suite of burn spells, they will set our opponent's worlds on fire instead. Since the core of this build is sculpted around Imodane's direct damage ability, protecting her becomes paramount to the build's success. So let's protect her. If we control the commander, then we can cast Deflecting Swat without paying its mana cost and choose new targets for target spell or ability. Swiftfoot Boots gives equipped creature hexproof and haste. Note that the presence of hexproof allows us to target the creature equipped by the boots, and not our opponents. This feature is vitally important, because we could target our own creature with single target instant and sorcery spells through hexproof, but not through Shroud, which another popular equipment, Lightning Greaves, provides, but is not included in the core of this build. There are more ways to offer protection than pseudo-countermagic and hexproof. Darksteel Plate, Shield of Kaldra, and Mithril Coat are indestructible and give equipped creature indestructible as well. Hammer of Nazan also gives equipped creature indestructible as well as +2/+0, and whenever it or another equipment enters the battlefield under our control, we may attach that equipment to target creature we control. Note that Mithril Coat has Flash, which means that we may cast it at any time we could cast an instant, and when it enters the battlefield, we attach it to target legendary creature we control. Now let's bring this video to a close with a smattering of cards that synergize with and strengthen our burn theme. Increasing Vengeance copies target instant or sorcery spell we control. If we cast this card from our graveyard through its flashback cost of 3 and 2 red mana, then we copy that spell twice instead. In each instance, we may choose new targets for the copy. Reverberate copies any target instant or sorcery spell, again allowing us to choose new targets for the copy. Storm King's Thunder has us copy the next instant or sorcery spell we cast this turn X times, and, of course, we may choose new targets for the copies. Reiterate kicks up the spell copying a few notches with its buyback ability. We can pay an additional 3 generic mana when we cast it, and if we do, then we put the card into our hand as it resolves. With a finely tuned mono-red mana base, buying back Reiterate over and over again should be as easy as Sunday morning. Speaking of finely tuned mono-red mana bases, no burn deck is complete without a copy of Pyromancer's Goggles. We tap it to add a red mana to our mana pool, and when that mana is spent to cast a red instant or sorcery spell, we copy that spell, and we may choose new targets for the copy. Continuing with our focus on this build's potential mana base, some accelerated mana production is always welcome when attempting to cast a big ol' burn spell. Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual add 3 red mana to our mana pool for the cost of 1 and 1 red mana each, while Seething Song adds 5 red mana for just 2 and 1 red mana. Mana Geyser adds a red mana to our mana pool for each tapped land our opponents control, while Jessica's Will has 2 options from which to choose. We either add a red mana for each card in target opponent's hand, or we exile the top 3 cards of our library, and we may play them this turn. If we control a commander as we cast the spell, then we may choose both options. For repeatable sources of mana enhancement, at the beginning of our post-combat main phase, Neheb the Eternal adds a red mana for each 1 life lost by our opponents this turn. Alongside Imodane, this interaction could be game-ending. Leyline Tyrant prevents us from losing unspent red mana as steps and phases end, and when it dies, we may pay any amount of red mana to have it deal that much damage to any target. Note that this red mana does not have to be stored and used solely for Leyline Tyrant's ability. We can use this mana at any time while the Tyrant is in play, and if it were to die, then we would have until the end of the current step or phase to spend whatever red mana is in our mana pool before it empties as normal. Generally, in building around series videos like this one, we leave the land base in the hands of each individual deck brewer. However, we would be remiss if we failed to mention a strategic way to cultivate this build land base. Since we're playing mono-red, all signs point to Mountain as being the most featured land in our build. But it shouldn't. Instead of playing with mountains, we are going to play with snow-covered mountains instead. Why? Because when Extraplanar Lens comes into play, we exile target land we control. Whenever a land with the same name as the exiled card is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. In any mono-colored deck, Extraplanar Lens can provide a massive boost in mana resources if utilized in this strategic way. It is far less likely than any of our opponents with red in their EDH decks are playing with snow-covered mountains instead of mountains. This way, we restrict the double mana producing lands to only snow-covered mountains, of which we have a plethora, and our opponents, most likely, will have none. This brings us to the last offering of cards we have for the core of this Imodane burn deck. Ruby Medallion reduces the cost of our red spells by 1 generic mana. Although its ability is a global effect that helps our opponents, having Mana Flare on our side of the battlefield should still tip the game in our favor. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. Our burn spells should benefit more from this form of mana enhancement than the spells our opponents cast. And if we also control the aforementioned Extraplanar Lens, then we should have little to no difficulty winning the game. Invoke Calamity is a great way to recursively cast our instant and or sorcery cards, particularly our mana accelerators and fixed direct damage dealers that were cast earlier in the game. It allows us to cast up to 2 target instant and or sorcery spells with mana value 6 or less from our graveyard and or our hand without paying their mana costs. If those spells will be put into our graveyard, then we exile them instead, and, upon resolution, we exile Invoke Calamity. Remember, we do not want to target our X spells here, as X equals 0 when casting spells without paying their actual mana costs. Yes, we could cast sorcery spells from our hand as instants this way, but it would serve us better to utilize our graveyard for recasting our spells. Another win condition in this build is Grafted Exoskeleton, which surely will induce the Salt to rain down upon us from our opponents. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has Infect, and whenever Grafted Exoskeleton becomes unattached from a permanent, we sacrifice that permanent. Note that a creature with Infect deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and deals damage to players in the form of poison counters. A player with 10 or more poison counters loses the game. Note that all damage done by creatures with Infect puts -1/-1 counters on creatures and poison counters on players, not just combat damage. In this build, we want to equip Grafted Exoskeleton to Imodane, and whenever Imodane triggers and deals damage to our opponents, that damage will come in the form of poison counters, which should lead to a quick and sickening victory over our opponents. Hopefully, our opponent's desire to play Magic with us again in the future will not be poisoned. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a mono-red burn commander deck with Imodane the Pyrohammer as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a burn EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlist on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this Imodane build in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.